So
Hi.
our session will be starting now, and our first speaker is Dr. Srinivas K. Rao. He is from Chennai, and he is my very good friend, and he was the president of Cornea Society of India. Dr. Srinivas.
Thank you, Samar. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to congratulate the Bombay Ophthalmic Association on this, what seems to be a superbly organized meeting, and thank them for the invitation to be here. I've been asked to speak about ocular surface staining
Good morning,
using
Dr. Rao,
dyes.
sir.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. So I've been asked to
I
speak
can
in the
hear
next
you.
10 minutes about ocular surface staining using dyes, and this is not a new procedure. It's been done over the last century or so. We use these dyes to stain the ocular surface to detect the presence of changes, use the changes that we see to diagnose disease, help to document the extent, which helps us tell the patient about the prognosis, and finally to monitor the progress of the disease and its outcomes. We can use it in various ways. For example, we can use it to look at the effects of dryness on the ocular surface. We can use it to stain the tear meniscus to measure its height. We can use it to look at the evacuation of tears from the surface in the clearance test, use it to look at the extent of damage in a chemical injury, and to look at the morphology of the various epithelial defects and corneal infections. We can use it as a CDUS test to look for leaks, effects of contact lens use on the surface, and in epithelial ingrowths in a post-LASIK flap. If you see a point of staining at the edge of the flap, it tells you that there's a communication, which means that this needs surgical management. It helps you distinguish between folds and striae in the LASIK flap, and in an elevated lesion, it may help you confirm the presence of an ocular surface dysplasia. We can also use it for non-ocular surface uses like applanation, tonometry, contact lens fit, looking at the patency of the nasolacrimal duct system, and in identifying the proximal cut edge of the canaliculus and lid repair, and finally in anterior segment fluorescein angiography. A normal corneal surface generally does not stain, and that is because of the health of the epithelial cell, the presence of tight junctions, and a nice glycocalyx. When you have disease like superficial punctate keratitis, it indicates a loss of these tight junctions, a loss of the glycocalyx, or individual cell death, and because of that, you see this fine spotty staining. When the disease progresses, in addition, there is increased cell death, which involves more layers of the corneal epithelium, and then you tend to see broader areas of staining called punctate epithelial erosions. Cells can also get proliferated, and you can get heaped up cells like this when you have sometimes adenoviral keratitis or microsporidial changes, and this is punctate epithelial keratitis. And the way to differentiate these from erosions is to make a slit. And here you can see the elevation of these cells, whereas in the erosion, there is a concave depression. And of course, the final stage is when you lose all of the cell layers of the epithelium, when you get the classical epithelial defect itself. Now, the ability of the dye to percolate through this epithelium depends on the molecular size, and fluorescein just about is able to get through the epithelium. The other two cannot. It also depends upon the charge of the molecule, the shape, and the overall dimension. And this fluorescein tends to stain the cytoplasm, which means it stains more quickly, but also dissipates more quickly, whereas rose bengal and lissamine stain the nucleus, which tends to take longer and is more hardy. Conjunctivoid tends to be very diffusive because their cells do not have the tight junctions. We generally use fluorescein for the cornea, but because rose bengal is more irritating and more toxic to the cells, and also it's easier to appreciate the green color against an angry red background, for conjunctival staining today, lissamine green is generally preferred. When you look at the tear meniscus with fluorescein, as the concentration of fluorescein increases, the fluorescence increases as well. But when you exceed 0.25%, there is a decrease in fluorescence called the quenching phenomenon. And therefore, if you get maximal fluorescence, you need to use the correct amount of 1 microliter of the 2% fluorescein, because when it gets diluted in the 10 microliters of tears on the surface, you'll get the optimal concentration of 0.2%. These are two techniques that you can use. In this first technique, in my clinic assistant who has a normal surface, I'm putting one drop, which is 30 to 50 microliters on the ocular surface, just putting the drop from the strip. Whereas the more ideal way would be to take the drop on the fluorescein strip and then shake it off vigorously for a couple of times and just put this 1 to 2 microliters on the lid margin. In the first instance, you see a lot of fluorescein in the tear film itself, and this can mask any stains on the corneal surface. Whereas in the second, you can see that there is adequate fluorescein in the tear meniscus, but the corneal surface staining can now be appreciated better. Of course, this is a normalized, there's no finding, but in a patient with pathology, this would be a better way to do it. If you have a fluorescein-trained surface, in order to excite it maximally, we use a cobalt blue filter so that the appropriate light of excitation reaches the surface. And then when the light is reflected back, in order to take away the blue light and appreciate the fluorescence better, we can use a Raton yellow filter so that only the fluorescence comes into our sight. So this is an early keratitis where you can see that the yellow filter highlights the staining. This is a disintegrating dendrite following DALK with the herpes simplex keratitis. And this is an elevated lesion due to ocular surface squamous neoplasia. And you can see in all of these, the yellow filter enhances the staining. But the true benefit would come when you're looking at conjunctival staining, because normally the blue light is intensely reflected from the white sclera, and you cannot use fluorescein to look at the conjunctiva. This is an example of lissamine green staining of a patient, and the same patient stained with fluorescein, but with the yellow filter, you can see the same extent of staining that is there. And therefore, if you have a yellow filter in your slit lamp, the only dye that you need is fluorescein. If you don't have an yellow filter, these external filters are easily available. They are not very expensive. You can hold it in front of the objective of your slit lamp to appreciate the findings. The timing at which you look at the fluorescein is also important. Immediately after you put it in, as I said, there is fluorescein in the tear film which blocks the visualization. But in a dry eye, it takes time for the fluorescein to dilute and pick up the staining. So waiting 45 seconds to a minute is ideal. But if you wait 4 minutes and 10 minutes, there's a lot of diffusion in the epithelium and the pattern can get lost. This is not relevant with rose bengal and lissamine green, where you can even look at it 2 minutes later. When you have irregularities on the corneal surface, you must distinguish staining from pooling, as in this recurrence in a Moran's ulcer. The recurrence is in this very small area, but the initial impression is that the entire gutter is staining. If you wash it off with normal saline, the actual staining can be picked up. In order to assess the staining, I tend to divide the ocular surface into 3 parts and the cornea into 3 parts as well. And each of these is semi-quantitatively graded from 0 to 3 to give a total score of 15. You can look at the lid viper, which is the terminal 2 to 3 millimeters of the upper bulbar conjunctiva. And you can look for the line of marks, which is the rose bengal stippling along the openings of the meibomian glands. In the cornea, if the staining is only in the inferior 1/3, it generally depicts lid margin disease. This is because of the toxins pooling in the tear meniscus. If it's only in the upper 1/3, it has to do with the upper lid, typically allergic changes. In the interpalpebral exposed area, it often indicates a tear deficit. But if the staining is of the entire cornea, including the uppermost 2 millimeters protected by the upper lid, this is either a very severe dry eye, in which case you will also get equivalent conjunctival staining, or it could indicate toxicity from the medication you're using or the preservative, because that tends to seep under the upper lid itself. In the conjunctiva, you can see the superior limbal staining in superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis. And if you have conjunctivochalasis, the repeated trauma will cause inferior bulbar conjunctival staining. Nasal staining can be seen in mucus fishing syndrome and in canaliculitis, and temporal staining in angular conjunctivitis. We already spoke about lid viper epitheliopathy in the upper eyelid, and the line of marks tends to move more posteriorly in a dry eye with a deficient tear meniscus. If you have staining and inflammation below a horizontal line joining the 2 canthi, then it typically indicates toxicity from the medication, something like gentamicin, because most people apply the drop in the inferior fornix. And in the early stages, the corneal staining would also exceed the conjunctival staining, because the conjunctiva is generally a more robust epithelium and it's able to withstand this better in the initial stages. If you have a patient with very significant symptoms and extensive redness of the surface, but with minimal corneal and conjunctival staining, this usually depicts inflammation as the cause of his problems. So essentially, these are the 3 dyes that we can use. You can use them concurrently, either sequentially or as a combined solution. And the order in which you want to use them is probably this: put in the fluorescein, look for the fluorescein breakup time, then assess your corneal staining patterns. Then if you don't have an yellow filter, put lissamine green to look for the conjunctival staining. Then do your contact text like the Sherman. And finally, you can look at the secretions from the meibomian glands by expressing them. So ocular staining is generally not necessary in a routine eye exam. You use it when patient symptoms suggest ocular surface disease, or in a patient with a known underlying condition like rheumatoid arthritis, where we know that there can be changes even if the patient does not complain because of neurotrophic changes. These changes, as I said, help you detect, diagnose, grade, and prognosticate the ocular surface disease and monitor your treatment outcomes. So understanding the basis of ocular surface staining is very important. This is a very simple but extremely useful test. But you must understand the dyes and understand their appropriate use, and the appropriate examination technique must be used. Categorizing these changes in the clinic using some kind of a simple grading system like I showed you will help you. And if you have an LO filter in your slit lamp or you're willing to buy one, fluorescein is the only thing that you need. But if you don't have this, then you could use lissamine green along with fluorescein to assess the conjunctiva as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srini. Very nice, comprehensive talk.
Hello. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Srinivas Rao. Whenever we listen to Srinivas Rao, there are always some points to take, isn't it? Although fluorescence staining and everything, it appears so simple, but the importance of it can be understood well after his talk. Now I call upon the next speaker, Dr. Samar Basak, our chairman of this particular session, who is in fact a director of Disha Hospitals and director of Pruva Eye Banks. He has got many publications and awards to his credit. The list is never ending. He has published 2 books, one on Essentials of Ophthalmology and second, Atlas of Clinical Ophthalmology. Out of so many books he has published, I call upon him to talk on donor preparation in DMEC, BCL interface technique. Sir.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Nikhil and Lahane sir and Dr. Ragini and all your team for inviting me in this talk. And this is a wonderful gathering. And I'll be talking on something, donor preparation in DMEC. It is a different technique because of this COVID pandemic. So there is extreme mismatch between supply and demand of cornea donor. So lamellar keratoplasty is one of the good opportunity where we can split the corneal donor tissue and increase our donor pool. This is a review article in Cornea in last year, where we can see that one cornea can be used for multiple recipient. It could be crucial to act in a timely manner as we expect an increased burden in next 2 to 3 years. And it is likely that we'll have to live with SARS-CoV-2 for at least for that long or even more. There are many articles on COVID-19 and eye banking. You will see a lot of publication. There is decrease in donor pool and the demand is remaining the same. So already this is not a new concept, but this study from the same group from Germany, Klaus Korsifen, and they have shown that one tissue can be used for DALK and DMEC, and they have published 100 consecutive patients, but their technique is different because DMEC donor tissue. Right now, Namrata has been explained what is stamped and non-stamped, but non-stamped, if you have IOCT microscope, then it is easier to do. Otherwise, most of the people prefer stamped DMEC donor graft. So one cornea for DMEC and that same cornea can be used for DALK. And as Namrata has also explained that most of the people used ACE or F stamped DMEC donor graft. That is Wideck technique. I have recently made one video for American Academy and I am sharing that video with you. This is just 7 minutes video.
तो Zoom का connection देखो. How do I connect? Zoom का क्या है? Password, login, what is it? तेरा email?
Yeah.
Sushmita ji shine. Password. कौन सा वाला ये लिंक? नहीं, समर फोकस ना.
Oh. I'm sorry, it is stopped.
Forward, yes.
No, it is not playing. No.
So it was playing, but no sound earlier.
No, it has stopped. Both
Now it has
audio,
stopped.
video, both have stopped.
Both had stopped.
Yes.
Just both have stopped. I think I need to escape.
Can you close it and
My internet connection is showing poor connectivity. That is the messages I'm getting.
And you turn off
So
your video, Samar, then sometimes it helps. Turn off your video and just play the presentation, might help.
right, this is the only video I want to show, but it is not.
No, your video, no, turn it off. You don't have to be on video. Just play the presentation. Stop
I'm-
video for yourself.
Oh, for
Your
no,
personal video.
the
just
internet is not working.
SKR is saying turn off your video on Zoom, on Zoom. So that will probably help with the connectivity. Your Zoom video, you can turn it off.
So video.
आपका video, your face should not be seen. That's what they're trying to tell you. Okay,
Okay.
your face. No, not there.
It is just rounding. It is not responding. Okay, you can carry forward. It is not responding to that. That the Zoom platform is not opening also.
Sir,
So you can carry forward. I think the next
I think that
speaker.
would be better. We can go to the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
and revert back to you again.
Yeah. I will show the video separately only from
Yeah.
that particular area.
Right.
Savita madam?
Yes.
Kavita, yes.
Thank you so much and good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker. She is Dr. Geeta Iyer. I think she really needs no introduction. She is the Senior Cornea Consultant at the Ocular Surface Department and the Cornea Department at Shankara Nethralaya. She has excelled in ocular surface disease management, and she is going to talk to us about use of mucous membrane grafting in Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So yes, over to you, Geeta. Is Geeta there? Geeta,
Yes.
yes.
Can you hear me? I'm there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Greetings to one and all of you.
Yeah.
Hope praying for the safety of all of us during these extremely unprecedented and trying pandemic times. Let me thank BOA for having put together this wonderful scientific program. and I will be speaking to you on mucous membrane grafting in Stevens-Johnson syndrome.
Madam, sorry to interrupt you. You need to close the mic. You need to close to the mic.
Sorry?
You need to be closer to your mic is what sir is saying. You're not very audible, Geeta.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, it's better. Yes.
Okay, fine. So I'm going to be speaking on mucous membrane grafting in Stevens-Johnson syndrome. In case I'm not audible, please let me know. So we all know that Stevens-Johnson syndrome is a chronic inflammatory condition of the ocular surface, and amongst the several ocular surface sequelae that it leads to, one of the issues that has been identified as an important cause for the continued inflammation that leads to a deterioration of the ocular surface and worsening of the limbal status is lid margin keratinization, which is what I'm going to be speaking about. It's extremely important to also understand the extent of associated dryness, another important cause for persistent inflammation in these eyes, which needs aggressive management. So when we speak about lid margin keratinization or LMK, as these pictures show here, you can have a varying involvement of the lid margin. Usually it extends up to the subtarsal fold, though it could definitely extend beyond just the lid margin alone. Based on the extent of involvement, we have graded LMK into 4 grades. Of course, you can have variations in this, such as a patchy keratinization involving different areas of the lid margin. And in this situation, it's important to assess the extent of associated dryness, because dryness is something which increases the friction between the lid margin keratinization and the ocular surface, worsening the effect of the lid margin keratinization. So why is it that we are really worried about LMK? It's because of these several deleterious effects of LMK, especially on the cornea, which is caused by blink-induced microtrauma, namely corneal epitheliopathy, stromal melt, corneal vascularization, secondary corneal infection, especially following the injudicious use of topical steroids in these eyes to try and calm the surface inflammation. And in rare instances, you can also end up having a corneal perforation in these eyes. So how do you really decide when and how you would want to intervene for lid margin keratinization? Decision making is important, and there are several factors that have a role to play in decision making. It would depend on the grade of LMK, of course, the patient's symptoms that are associated with the LMK, the extent of corneal damage, the Schirmer's wetting, surface keratinization, and the need for intraocular procedures. What are the indications for surgery? When you have LMK of more than grade 1, which is causing a corresponding change in the cornea with respect to a punctate keratopathy or corneal vascularization, then this is definitely an indication for surgery. Your preoperative preparation involves use of antiseptic mouthwash 4 times a day for a week prior to surgery, and it's important that you rule out active inflammation or ulceration of the oral mucosa. How quickly out of the acute SJS can MMG be performed? Well, as early as is permissible to take up the patient for surgery without any risk if the LMK warrants surgery. There are some situations when even a month or 6 weeks following the SJS, patients can come and present with a severe amount of lid margin keratinization that is causing ocular surface damage. Before I actually start the video, which highlights the technique of performing mucous membrane grafting for lid margin keratinization in SJS, we normally do this procedure under general anesthesia. If you are planning for surgery in all 4 lids, if you are a beginner, it would probably be preferable to do one eye at a time. It can be done under local anesthesia. General anesthesia is more comfortable. And we prepare and harvest the mucous membrane grafting for all the 4 lids. The surgery begins by everting the lids over buds so that you stretch the eyelids, and the keratinized lid margin is separated and excised off the underlying tarsal plate. The lip mucosa is marked in order to harvest mucosa sufficient for all the 4 lids, and the mucosa is dissected. The edges of the mucosa can be sutured. This is the mucosa being trimmed off the subcutaneous tissue, divided into 4 parts, and then each part is sutured to the lid margin along the edge, which is adjacent to the lid margin using 8-0 Vicryl. The rest of the mucosa is stretched over the bed and stuck and secured using fibrin glue and apposed to the cut edge of the conjunctiva. So this basically involves the actual surgical procedure of mucous membrane grafting in these eyes. And these are some of the long-term post-operative outcomes in our patients who are out of this procedure almost 14 to 15 years following the same for lid margin keratinization, where the surface has continued to remain stable without further deterioration. These patients definitely benefit with the use of PROS lenses, especially if there is an associated corneal haze or dryness, which helps provide comfort as well as improvement in vision. These are another couple of patients who are 14 to 15 years post the procedure, where we've been able to stabilize the ocular surface, improve patient comfort, and allow them to pursue their career and education over a period of 15 years. The immediate postoperative management involves continuation of the antiseptic mouthwash for a couple of weeks, topical antibiotics in the eye, and topical lubricants. Usually we prefer to remove the suture at 1 week, because when you have loosening of the sutures, the loose sutures could rub on the ocular surface and the cornea and cause an epithelial defect, which you do not want in these eyes. Steroids, usually either topical or systemic, do not form a part of the routine postoperative regimen in our experience. In fact, a couple of days following the procedure, you can see a significant abatement in the surface inflammation without the use of topical steroids, just because of the removal of the keratinized strip of the lid margin in these eyes and replacing it with a smooth oral mucosal graft. Our results in brief, just to highlight what we have analyzed in 626 eyes of 371 patients, you can see that almost 98% of patients showed stabilization or improvement in the ocular comfort as assessed by fluorescein staining and Schirmer's, and the vision stabilized or improved in almost 96% of these eyes. You can also see a significant shift in the best corrected visual acuity in these eyes to better than 624 or 660 at last follow-up following mucous membrane grafting in these eyes. The basic aim of mucous membrane grafting is not to improve vision, but then definitely in most of these eyes, the vision does tend to improve once the surface stabilizes and improves with respect to the punctate epitheliopathy. There can be a recurrence of lid margin keratinization requiring a resurgery in few of these eyes, and in our experience, this has been somewhere around 6%. This should be the post-op appearance of the mucosal graft, where the graft is absolutely flush with the lid surface. You don't really see any bulky mucosa on the external surface when the eye is open. And this basically helps even in a smooth surfacing of the tears on the ocular surface. Which brings me to the point as how not to do a mucous membrane grafting, because when you have a very bulky mucosa like this, which is placed on the lids, it not only causes, it not only is unsightly, but it also causes an ectropion of the lid. You end up having exposure related issues, and probably the surface tends to worsen because of the surgery rather than improve. And hence it's extremely important to understand the steps of the procedure and be meticulous with respect to thinning of the mucosa when you are placing the graft on the lid margins. Complications could be many, but I have just listed the major ones which we normally face, which can easily be dealt with. Bleeding during the lid dissection. If you end up going into a deeper dissection into the tarsal plate, you can always change your plane of dissection and stay more superficial. And buttonholing of the mucosa is not really a cause for concern, because you can approximate the edges of the buttonhole with the use of the fibrin glue that you are anyway going to be using during the procedure. Post-operative, again, necrosis of the graft is very, very rare. Infection is very rare. The only thing which you sometimes face when you do not remove the sutures is loosening of the sutures, and in rare instances, recurrence of the keratinization. These are some of the cases where we have had a recurrence, a residual keratinization, or a necrosis of the graft where you might have to redo your procedure. This is just to show how patients, this is a video which is not playing, but this is just to show how much the patients improve with respect to their comfort, which in turn reflects in their confidence and personality in the post-operative period. There are several additional procedures that can be performed simultaneously or subsequently along with mucous membrane grafting. When you have a severe dry eye, it is definitely beneficial to combine a punctal cautery along with the MMG or do it before the mucous membrane grafting. When you have to simultaneously do a fornix reconstruction, it is done along with mucous membrane grafting, either with amniotic membrane or the use of cultivated oral mucosal epithelium. This is done to stabilize the tear film, and especially in those eyes where you have a shortened fornix, but where you would want to facilitate fitting of the pros lenses and therefore better formation of the fornix, you would need to combine a fornix reconstruction with mucous membrane grafting. And in these situations, there is definitely a role for topical steroids in the post-operative period. When you perform a tectonic procedure for, say, a corneal perforation in these eyes, which has occurred because of the LMK, it is extremely important to do a mucous membrane grafting to address the primary cause, that is the lid margin keratinization, after you have performed the tectonic procedure. And it's important to stabilize the surface in these eyes so that you do not have a repeat of the same complication. If you have to take up these patients for elective procedures, it's again important to stabilize the ocular surface before these surgeries, especially if you're performing a cataract extraction. And it's advised that you do a mucous membrane grafting and stabilize the ocular surface in order to reduce the risk of complications in the post-operative period. So in summary, basically, lid margin keratinization, doing a mucous membrane grafting for it eliminates the lid viper-induced epitheliopathy. It not only improves patient comfort and ocular surface status, but prevents further deterioration of the ocular surface due to the blink-induced microtrauma. And this has been corroborated by the cytokine studies that we have done in our series of patients, where there has been an improvement in the cytokine profile in these eyes following mucous membrane grafting for lid margin keratinization. These are some of our publications since the time that we started doing these this particular procedure in 2005, where we have seen that it has been responsible for a paradigm shift in the management of these patients with ocular sequelae of Stevens-Johnson syndrome. And it was my honor and privilege to pen this guest editorial on this particular subject in the April issue of Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. And I would request you all to go through this to understand not just the history, but also the importance of performing this procedure for these patients. I would like to acknowledge the entire ocular surface team back home at Shankar Nethralaya, both Dr. Bhaskar and Dr. Shweta. And we offer a 3-month short-term ocular surface fellowship for those who might be interested to join us post your cornea fellowship. Thank you for a very patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta, for that wonderful comprehensive talk. I would like to introduce our next speaker. She's just like Geeta. She's also a Mumbai girl and Mumbai product. She is Dr. Swapna Shanbhag. She's going to talk to us about cicatricial dry eye, and she is a consultant at LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. Geeta, I just had 2 questions for you while Dr. Shanbhag is setting up her slides. The first being that you said you have a 6% rate of recurrence. So what would be the duration, between doing a resurgery? And second is, now with the COVID environment, any special precautions, any extra special precautions for harvesting the oral mucosa, and would you recommend doing surgery at this point, or anything special that you follow?
Yes. So for your first question, with respect to recurrence, usually you have a creeping in of the keratinization that occurs months after the primary procedure is done, and you can redo the surgery even 2 to 3 months following the primary procedure. You need to make sure that you do not reharvest the mucosa from the site where you have harvested it earlier, because there will be some amount of fibrosis, submucosal fibrosis there, and you can change your site of harvesting the mucosa. With respect to the second question, when the pandemic is at its peak, it's preferable. Probably you can wait and do the mucous membrane grafting. But in between, when we did have time, we additionally used a face shield. And if possible, you can try and see if you can harvest the oral mucosa also under the microscope, so that you're far away from the patient's
Oh.
face.
But best
Thank
thing
you,
will
Geeta.
be to wait, isn't it? Because
Yes,
of
it's
both the
better.
fears, virus fear of virus, as well as now of mucormycosis. Both ways, it
Yes.
will be better to wait and then do it. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, Kavita, please continue.
Thank you, Geeta. Over to Swapna. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. I thank the organizers of BOA and MOS and Dr. Nikhil Gokhale for providing me with this opportunity to present at this forum. So my topic is approach to cicatricial dry eye. I have no financial disclosures. So cicatrizing conjunctivitis is an entity which, because of severe ocular surface inflammation and conjunctival inflammation, can result in severe dry eyes, end-stage ocular surface disease, and permanent corneal blindness. Now, why should we diagnose cicatrizing conjunctivitis early? What is the need? Because as this entity progresses, the different etiologies become indistinguishable in the chronic phase, and treatment in end-stage disease in the chronic phase is mostly a type 2 K-Pro, which should be avoided because it's always difficult to perform and always difficult to even manage on follow-up. And also some of these conditions which are autoimmune have significant systemic morbidity. So I'll be presenting two cases just to show you how we can come to an etiological diagnosis for different conditions of cicatrizing conjunctivitis. So this was a 76-year-old female who presented to us from Hyderabad, Telangana. And she presented to us with left eye irritation and foreign body sensation since 2 months, diagnosed previously as dry eye disease and on lubricants. Looking at this picture, I do not have photos of the everted eyelid, but she had meibomian gland blockage in both the lids, and she had rounded lid margins. And if you can look here, there is lateral canthal fibrosis. Now, this is quite significant, and that's why a very good ocular surface examination is required in most of these ocular surface cases. And when we everted the upper eyelid, you can see that there is some subtle conjunctival fibrosis present here near the lid margin. And even on the lower inferior fornix, there is fibrosis present and very early fornicial shortening, which is present. When we stained the ocular surface, she had significant SPKs on the entire cornea, and Schirmer's was 3 millimeters. Now, the provisional diagnosis in this case is chronic cicatrizing conjunctivitis in the left eye because of the superior tarsal involvement, the lateral canthal fibrosis, the inferior fornicial shortening with dry eye. She also had she was a pseudophakic case. Now, the right eye was perfectly normal in this case. Although we did a complete thorough examination, the right eye did not show any significant findings. Now coming to the differential diagnosis. This is a paper that we published in the November 2020 Journal of IJO, which gives a modified classification from Dr. Dart's paper on the different etiologies for chronic cicatrizing conjunctivitis. Now, how do we go about ruling out each of these causes? We need to rule out a lot of causes, and this is shown very beautifully in Dr. Dart's paper. This is a very landmark paper published in 2017, where he has shown these different cases which all present in a similar manner. But as you can see, the diagnosis is different in each and every case. So this throws a big conundrum on how to diagnose these cases. So we have come up with an algorithm for diagnosis of the etiology of chronic cicatrizing conjunctivitis, where we go about asking a very detailed history to each patient. Like in this case, we asked a history of since when was this symptoms, and then where was the history of trauma, chemical burns in the past, or any repeated surgeries that were done, and any bone marrow transplantation or head and neck radiotherapy, because all of these lead to conditions which can present similarly. Again, use of glaucoma eye drops can cause drug-induced cicatrizing conjunctivitis, and a history of dry mouth or joint pains can lead to Sjogren's or secondary Sjogren's. But the patient gave us no history of any of these. And the final question in our algorithm is if there is past history of skin or mucosal involvement. Now, there was no past history of skin or mucosal involvement. Mucosa in this case means oral mucosa, genital mucosa, and the conjunctiva too. So there is an entity known as mucous membrane pemphigoid of only the ocular variant, that is only the eye is affected. So it is possible that this could have been the diagnosis for this case. So if we come to this differential diagnosis, then we do a serological profile to rule out other autoimmune disorders and also do a conjunctival biopsy. For this patient, the ESR was raised, the RA factor was negative, the ANA profile was also negative. So we went ahead and did a conjunctival biopsy from both the eyes. We take biopsy from both the eyes because that's what is recommended, even though one eye is not involved. And the biopsy should ideally be taken from the perilesional conjunctiva. And we take a small sample of 4 by 4 millimeters, divide it into 2 parts and send it to histopathology and for direct immunofluorescence. Histopathology is mainly to rule out masquerades such as neoplasia, which sometimes can present as cicatrizing conjunctivitis. So we at LVPI have the luxury of having the pathology lab right next door, and that's why we can send the samples immediately for immunofluorescence in OCT media. However, in private practice or elsewhere where you do not have this luxury of having a pathology lab immediately close to you, you can take this Michel's transport media from the pathology lab and put your sample in this and then send it for immunofluorescence. So this is a good transport media if you cannot send it for any further immunofluorescence immediately. For this patient, the direct immunofluorescence was positive and there was linear deposition, as can be seen here, at the basement membrane. So the final diagnosis was left eye mucous membrane pemphigoid with severe aqueous deficiency, dry eye. So we've also given an algorithm in the same paper about the different treatment modalities for the different etiologies. As you can see, this was a case of progressive cicatrization possibly, and MMP causes progressive cicatrization. So to arrest progression, the main modality is systemic immunosuppression. So that's what we did for this patient. We did baseline blood investigations. We gave oral cyclophosphamide 1 mg per kg and kept a very close monitoring of the ocular surface of both the eyes and explained to the patient what the prognosis of this disease is, which is very important for these cases. And we also treated her with topical lubricants, and topical steroids are only used if there is acute ocular surface inflammation. Now, what happens if we do not immunosuppress these patients? So this is a Foster staging system for MMP. And this shows that in the early cases with just subepithelial fibrosis, if not treated adequately with immunosuppression, can quickly progress to a complete ankyloblepharon and keratinization of the ocular surface. And then this becomes a very difficult entity to treat. So the conclusion of this case is history taking is very important. Slit lamp examination is vital to reach this etiological diagnosis, and a conjunctival biopsy should be performed for a confirmed diagnosis and also to rule out masquerades. And this is mainly to prevent an eye like this to be converted into an eye like this. I'll quickly run through the second case. And this was a 36-year-old female who presented to us from West Bengal, both eye blurring since 12 years, and she gave an history of an episode of chickenpox. So looking at this, the right eye had a best corrected visual acuity of 20/250, whereas the left eye was 20/80. And she had this typical very pillar-like fornicial shortening in the medial and the lateral canthus. And when we everted the right eye upper lid, she didn't have anything very specific on the lid margin, had one dystichiatic lash, had some amount of subepithelial fibrosis, if you can see here, and the complete morphology of the meibomian glands is lost here. And she had significant fornicial shortening in the right eye and a pannus growing over the cornea, which is partial limbal stem cell deficiency with significant corneal vascularization with a Schirmer's of 4. In the left eye, again, very similar findings, very subtle subepithelial fibrosis, morphology of the meibomian glands are completely lost. Again, inferior fornicial shortening, and the cornea is not as involved as it was in the right eye. And the Schirmer's in this eye is 5. So the provisional diagnosis was both eye chronic cicatrizing conjunctivitis with severe aqueous deficiency dry eye with right eye partial LSCD. Now again, coming to this, This patient did not give history of any of the above, but did give history of past skin and mucosal involvement. So in this case, we do an SJS scoring, and which I'll enumerate on the next slide. So this is again a paper we published last year in BJO, where we gave a scoring system where if a patient comes to you in the chronic phase of cicatrizing conjunctivitis, how can you reach to a diagnosis of SJS, or how can you rule out a diagnosis of SJS? So on this scoring system, if the score is more than 5, then it is typical of SJS. So we ask a medical history with the following, like a sudden onset of conjunctivitis, drug intake, associated with peeling of skin on pressure, associated with loss of nails on fingers or toes, again, very characteristic in the acute phase. So this entire history is for the acute phase. And unfortunately, most patients present to us very late in the chronic phase. Clinical examination, again, skin discoloration is very typical in patients with SJS, but cannot be...
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You need to be fast.
Yes, I'll be just finishing. And disfigured fingernails or toenails, posterior migration of the mucocutaneous junction, lid margin keratinization, and distichiasis. So these are the points on clinical examination. For this patient, we got actually a score of +7, and hence we came to a diagnosis of SJS for this patient. Now, how do we go about with the treatment? Because this is a case of SJS, we have to look at the lids and the amount of dry eye and the keratopathy. And that's why the best option for her is scleral contact lenses. She didn't have significant lid margin disease, so no MMG is required in this case. But because we were unable to fit scleral lenses due to fornical shortening, we did a mucous membrane graft over the bulbar surface, followed by scleral lens fitting after 2 months, and her vision has significantly improved, and she's doing very well. So the conclusion is history taking, general examination, slit lamp examination, and the scoring system are all very vital to reach the etiological diagnosis in these cases. And we should know what kind of autoimmune workup is to be done. We should have a low threshold for conjunctival biopsy in cases with a very equivocal SJS score of 5 or less than 5. And we should know about what all systemic involvement to look for and ask for, and timely initiation of immunosuppression. So these are 2 papers which give a lot of information on this entity. And I would like to thank the Ocular Surface team at LVPI, my colleagues, and thank you again. Thanks for this opportunity, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sapna. I think Dr. Basak is now ready with his slides.
Yes.
Thank you.
So
Share screen.
I'm sharing, but your cannot start screen share. What other? She has to. Swapna has to.
Yeah, Swapna has to stop.
I have stopped it.
Okay.
Share.
So
Yeah.
So I am playing.
Sir, is there audio also?
Audio is not.
Acha. Good.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful video, sir. Yes.
Excellent video, sir. With this, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Arun Jain, who's a professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the PGI MER Chandigarh. Apart from being a very astute clinician and a renowned cornea and ocular surface specialist, Dr. Jain has about 100 peer-reviewed publications with more than 1100 citations. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Jain with us. He's going to talk on wave-like epitheliopathy, simple management techniques. Over to you, Dr. Jain.
Thank you so much. At the very outset, I will. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right. So at the very outset, I'd like to thank Nikhil Gokhale as well as Dr. Ragini, Dr. T.P. Lahane, as well as whole team of BOA as well as Maharashtra Ophthalmological Society to give me this opportunity to share my views on wave-like epitheliopathy. It is not so uncommon. We have seen this in various patients like contact lens users or very chronic patients of diabetic nephropathy or neuropathy, as well as repeated surgeries at the limbus. So I'll presenting two cases to just make you aware of the situation, how it presents, and then we will discuss very simple management of this case of wave-like epitheliopathy, which leads to a drastic diminution of vision in these cases, and a simple technique will restore the vision within 2-3 days. So this is the first case which presented 40 years male. It was a high myope who was using RGPs for last almost 20 years, and he had thin corneas, and somebody had diagnosed him as a keratoconus outside and advised C3R. But the patient came to us seeking the second opinion, and this is the vision. Like in the left eye, vision was not improving beyond 6/18, and this is the pentacam image, and left eye shows inferior temporal stiffening, and the pentacam says it is a keratoconus grade 2. And if we see, the Kmax was 48.7 in the right eye with maximum corneal thickness 476, and in left eye Kmax shows 55.8 and maximum corneal thickness was 373. And on anterior segment examination on the right eye, this is the 10x magnification, cornea was unremarkable. And if we see the left eye at 6x magnification, you hardly see anything, but there's a wavy line you can see crossing the pupil. And on larger magnification, you can see this wave-like slightly opalescent epithelium covering whole of the pupil. And this is in retroillumination. This is what the culprit is. And this was reducing his vision to almost 6/18, which is not improving beyond that. And this is on fluorescent staining. You can see there's a pulling as well as stippled staining of the dye, because this wave-like epitheliopathy is thinner than the rest of the corneal epithelium. And this is the higher magnification of it. And this is on the slit lamp, thin slits. You can see it is only the epithelium which is involved. And on inversion of upper eyelid, you could see mild papillary mild papillary conjunctivitis because of contact lens use. So we made a differential diagnosis of wave-like epitheliopathy or contact lens induced keratopathy. Sometimes we may confuse it with SLK as well as corneal intraepithelial neoplasia, which already covered by one of the previous speakers from Ahmedabad, as well as corneal epithelial keratinization. But this was a case of bilateral high myopia with RGP use over a long period of time, which has led to a wave-like epitheliopathy. And on corneal topography, atlas topography, you can see the corneal irregularity. This index is around 5.43, and there's a hot area in the inferior temporal area. And we did a simple debridement of the epithelium, abnormal epithelium under topical anesthesia on the slit gland. And this is, after 1 week, you can see the cornea is clear of the abnormal epithelium, and patient had a restoration of this vision. And this is the difference made on the pentacam. You can see the improvement was drastic. And this is the Bellin-Ambrosio bad map. You can see there is a slightly elevation anteriorly, because this happens because the initial epithelium is multi-layered. As the time passes by, there's a compaction of epithelium in the center. And this is the, you can see corneal irregularity. This thing has improved from this thing to 1.41 micron. And this is the second case. This is a very old case. I'm following it for last almost 24 years. He presented to me in 1997. And at that time, he's a one-eyed patient, chronic angle closure glaucoma. He was on pilocarp in both eyes. Since the age of 30 years, he had glaucoma filtering surgery in the right eye 5 years ago, and underwent ECC with IOL surgery 4 years ago in 2004. And he had a partial limbal stem cell deficiency, for which we did a auto transplantation from the other eye. At that time, it was two hour segment. The SLET was not in vogue. So nowadays we could have done a SLET. So you can see the right and the left eye. We took a graft from this area and transplanted here, because this was a absolute eye. And if we see, this patient presented to us again with the diminution of vision. And if you see in the pupillary area, there's a wave-like hazy epithelium. And this is on staining. You can see wave-like epithelium. This was there even in the left eye. And growing from there, we have taken the limbal stem cell transplant and transplanted to the other eye. So what we did was, we did a de-epithelialization in this case, and patient got 6/9 vision after 3-4 days. And this is what the patient has after 2-3 days. Even other eye we didn't touch. So this is how the progression. This is patient had healing of the epithelial defect over a period of time. And as we all know, wave-like epitheliopathy is a chronic recurrent waves of irregular epithelium extending from the spear limbus toward the visual axis. And on histopathology, it has been shown that it is an abnormal population of parakeratotic limbal epithelial stem cells without any dysplasia, which proliferate and migrate centripetally. And on confocal microscopy, these abnormal basal epithelial cells with hyperrefractive nuclei and large nucleus to cytoplasmic ratio, and there's a loss of cellular border. This is how the cells look like. These are the normal cells, basal cells, but these are the abnormal basal cells on confocal microscopy. And the various risk factor for this condition is prior ocular surgery, toxicity to contact lens solutions, topical medication toxicity, most commonly the anti-glaucoma med, which was a culprit in one of the cases. Another case was contact lens users. Or it could also be because of underlying inflammatory disorder like OCP, or various derma disorder like acne rosacea or atopic dermatitis. We have seen few cases, old cases of trachomatis keratopathy also, and in diabetic, severe diabetes with the nephropathy and neuropathy. And in the literature, the treatment is, the literature is quite scant about the treatment part. The medical treatment usually fails in the form of topical lubricants and steroids or hypertonic saline. But the simple epithelium debridement leads to a total resolution within 3-5 days, but recurrences are quite common. Other treatment modality described application of 1% silver nitrate or a liquid nitrogen therapy. But again, with this liquid nitrogen or with silver nitrate cautery, recurrence rates are again to the tune of almost 50% as shown in this study. And this is what the paper in Cornea shows about the liquid nitrogen cryotherapy. And with this, they say the recurrence rate is nil, but again, the access to the liquid nitrogen may be not available to everyone. So here we describe a very simple technique which can be done on an OPD basis, and a thorough clinical examination is an absolute requirement for making a correct diagnosis, because a cursory examination on a low power, we will miss the wave-like epitheliopathy, because there is no vascularization in this case, and the epithelium is only abnormal and it's transparent. So simple epithelial debridement will cure and restore the vision in these cases. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jain, for highlighting this rarely discussed topic. I just had two quick questions, sir. First is any role of anterior segment OCT in delineating this feature, or differentiating it from CIN? And the second is your technique of epithelial debridement. Would you go for something like in alcohol, or would you do a manual debridement using a hockey stick blade?
So the answer to question number one is OCT can be used because, as I said, this abnormal epithelium is thinner than the rest of the normal corneal epithelium. So you can differentiate between the wave-like epithelium and the rest of the corneal epithelium. And as far as debridement is concerned, we used only topical Paracane, because putting it 2-3 times loosens the epithelium, because we don't want to use alcohol sitting on a slit lamp. Then again, you will have to shift the patient to some table in a lying down position, and we also don't want to sort of damage the rest of the limbal stem cells if there is a spillover of alcohol. So this is the simplest technique which can be done on a slit lamp.
Thank you, sir. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker. She is Dr. Nishita Agarwala. She is very renowned and our very own BOA member and faculty. So she's a consultant anterior segment surgeon with special interest in corneal disease and eye banking, and she is practicing at the prestigious PD Hinduja Hospital. And she is a pioneer, a doyen in the field of eye banking, as well as Mumbai and Maharashtra is concerned. And she is the honorary medical director of the Eye Bank Coordination Center. This is the EBCRC Mumbai, which has been doing phenomenal work in the field of eye banking. And we are very, very privileged to have Madam talk on the hurdles of eye banking during the COVID-19 era for us today. Very warm welcome to you, Madam, and thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you, Madam.
Madam, please unmute yourself.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yeah.
Sushmita, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I would like to thank BOS and the MOS organizers for this virtual focus meeting, and allowing me to participate and talk a little bit about the burden of COVID-19 on eye banking. So my slides are going to be presented by Dr. Rashmi, my co-consultant, because I have some problems with my computer. So Rashmi, will you move to the next, please? So since 1995, the Eye Bank has provided in excess of about 13,000 corneal grafts. And once the pandemic was declared in January 2020 by WHO, all collection activities came to a standstill. The next slide, Rashmi. And from March 20th, 2020 to September 2020, we had zero collection at the Eye Bank. But once the lockdown was lifted, we were able to collect quite a large number of corneas, and the utilization rate was also about 30%. But with the second wave, we again saw a dip in the collection, but we were able to collect corneas that were useful, and our utilization was much higher. Next slide. So as you can see, out of the 313 that were collected from October to December 2020, we used 112 corneas. And till April 21, we collected 150, but used about 100 corneas. Next. What was really disheartening is that during the pandemic, we had no access to tissue. And early in 2019, we had talks with Keralink USA to allow us to get some technology for making vision graft, which is a gamma irradiated cornea and a shelf life of 1 year at room temperature. This tissue is transparent. It can be used for DALK as well as for therapeutic keratoplasty. But the pandemic did not allow the technology transfer to occur. Next slide. And we had, in preparation for this vision graft, unutilized corneas that had been cryopreserved at -80 degrees Celsius. While we were wondering what to do and how to provide tissue for the patients that required at least therapeutic grafts, we came across this paper from Iran where they had used frozen whole eyes, the corneas from frozen whole eyes, for not only DALK, but for therapeutic grafting purposes. So, next slide. We had 140 of these tissues that were preserved, waiting to be converted to vision graft, but we could not use it. So instead, we were able to give away about 43. We were able to service 43 requests, and surgeons in private as well as government hospitals in Maharashtra had access to these, to this tissue. Now, the point here is that unused tissue came to our rescue, and it is something that we need to note that any unused tissue can easily now be cryopreserved, or we must store it in glycerol so that during another pandemic or during a shortage or emergency procedure when tissue is not available, we have access to this tissue more easily. Next slide. So Dr. Ganesh Gaikwad and Seema Mane have shared some of their slides with us in how they were able to use this tissue for at least restoring the eyeball structure. We did inform them that they need to do some microbiology on the corneal rim, just so that we were also sure that there was no infection being transferred. And of the rims that were subjected to microbiology, we just got one positive from Dr. Seema Mane. Next slide. Coming to the worldwide guidelines that have been set up for eye donation during this COVID period, EBAI and AIOS guidelines were very helpful in allowing us to discuss and check which were the eyes to get to go and collect, and which are the eyes that we ought to refuse right there on the phone. So this guideline did show us that if we had clear evidence that the patient had not any clinical symptoms which were compatible with COVID-19 and maybe a negative RT-PCR from a post-mortem nasal swab, we could proceed with donation. But while waiting for a nasal swab and RT-PCR, tissues had to be preserved in long-term media. We were testing our staff continuously. Rashmi, you can move to the next slide. Yeah, testing our staff continuously to ensure that they were safe. They were compulsorily made to use PPE suits, and all the disposable costs increased, and sanitization of the premises were taken to another level. Next slide. Of course, the cost of the tissue increased, but during the lockdown, the eye bank was closed for 4 months. We used those months to prepare new SOPs, provided some more online training for the staff on how to prepare dissect tissue, how to make demec tissue, because there were some tissues that were lying unused and they could practice on that. While the eye bank continued to provide the cryocorneas, we did have a stock of amniotic membrane grafts, and the patients who used autologous serum did come to the eye bank, and this was prepared for them. Next slide. So the ray of hope came in the form of clearer guidelines as to which tissue was good enough to collect. And the vaccination of staff also gave us a certain amount of confidence that our staff can go and collect these corneal donations. Next slide. But the hope did not come without despair, because during the COVID-19, we lost two of our best technicians, Dr. Rupesh Chauhan and Deepak Salunke. Both were with us for about 20 years. But here I would publicly like to thank all the corneal surgeons on this group who have helped in the welfare of their families, and by way of paying for their education, by way of paying for their food. So I just think that such community eye banking has really risen to higher levels when I saw their generosity through this one effort. Next slide. Our surgeons also face challenges, and the most important ones being that, if a patient turns out to be COVID positive, then surgery has to be postponed. If surgery is performed, how would the follow-ups be possible? How do you recognize and treat failures, rejections, and reinfections on telecons? Should immunosuppressants be increased? What will be the effect of vaccination on our corneal transplants? And what will be the effect of the COVID disease on our corneal transplants? Several times patients call up and say, okay, if I get my transplant done and I contract COVID, what shall I do? And some of the answers that we gleaned from some of the reading material is that if a patient contracts COVID, the plan should be that steroids be increased. He can get vaccinated, but prior to vaccination, steroids should be increased. And just a bit of caution over here that the corneas of viremic patients have shown virus material in conjunctiva, tears, and corneas. But is transmission expected? We don't know. It may be low, but there is inadequate research on that front. Next slide. This is some of the suggested reading from which we have got some of the answers and what we need to do for our patients as well as for the surgeons. And next slide. So as Dr. Basak said, that we have to duplicate the use from one corneal tissue. That was a beautiful, beautiful video that Dr. Basak showed us. One tissue for two patients. And I know with many different ideas coming in from all over the world, we will all overcome. We must work together. The corneal surgeons must participate in the eye banking activities in their local area. And this is only in our quest together to treat corneal blindness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nishita Madam, for showing us a ray of hope in such a pandemic period. Now it's time to call Dr. Shreya Thatte, who is a professor at Sri Aurobindo Hospital and Medical Research Center. She has many publications to her name, one of the prolific corneal surgeons. And she will be talking on conquering the pterygium and uncommon situations. Over to you, Shreya Madam.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I thank the organizers as well as the Dr. Nikhil Gokhale for giving me this topic of my interest, and that is conquering pterygium in uncommon situation. What you all are seeing in these different types of pterygium, they are showing the pigmentation with cystic degeneration. There are large pterygium covering the wide limbal involvement, even the double pterygium, pseudopterygium, and the recurrent pterygium. The most preferred technique for the pterygium surgery, pterygium management, is the pterygium excision with the conjunctival autograft. But how to manage this uncommon situation which is not routinely observed? In cystic degeneration and the pigmentary changes, we can manage these cases as routinely as we do in the simple pterygium. But where the large area of corneal involvement is there, or wide limbal involvement is there, or in case of double pterygium where we require larger conjunctival graft, we can modify the technique. Similar way, in case of pseudopterygium or the recurrent pterygium, we have to have some alternative technique with the modification. So in cystic degeneration and pigmentary degeneration, we just go for the pterygium excision with conjunctival limbal autograft. As you are seeing in this picture, this video, this is the simple nasal pterygium, and below one are the pigmentary and the cystic degeneration. So I do pterygium excision from in the reverse manner. So I remove the extended removal of the pterygium tissue from the fornix and then do the keratectomy. In this way, when you do this reverse keratectomy, you get a smooth corneal surface. And then I always take a conjunctival graft from the inferior inferior conjunctiva, inferior limbus. Always try to take without tenons and little bit larger conjunctiva, so to cover the bare sclera without any stretching of the conjunctiva, and always include the limbal stem cells with this. So what happens when there is large, wide or double pterygium? All these cases, they require the larger coverage as there is large bare sclera. Recently, 10 days back, I operated this pterygium with handshake technique, a handshake pterygium with larger involvement of the larger area. But as I was not having amniotic membrane in this pandemic area, so I did the conjunctival graft, and I took large amount of conjunctiva from the available conjunctiva in this patient. So we need some alternative, some replacement of conjunctival graft in these cases. Amniotic membrane can be used as a substrate which possibly cover the larger area. This membrane has anti-scarring, anti-angiogenic and anti-inflammatory property, which is helpful and needed in pterygium surgery. And it shows the similar effectiveness as with the conjunctival graft without any limbal tissue. But the recurrence when we are using only amniotic membrane is almost double because of the absence of the stem cells. So we need to replace these damaged stem cells. So you can utilize the concept of slat to provide the stem cells in this situation. How? Let us see. We can put the amniotic membrane, as this was double pterygium. So we can put amniotic membrane after the excision, and then we can put the stem cell lenticules as we do in the slat case. These are the two videos showing the nasal pterygium, and other one is the double pterygium. So the pterygium excision, as I said, it is the similar way. I take out from the fornix, and extended removal of the pterygium I always prefer, so that there is no pterygium tissue is left. Again, you can see with this reverse manner, you can get a very clear corneal and the scleral surface, and then you can glue the amniotic membrane and put the margins or the edges of the amniotic membrane beneath the conjunctiva, and then from the ipsilateral superiotemporal side, a small strip of the stem cells can be cut, and this strip can be cut into smaller pieces, and this again can be glued over the amniotic membrane near the limbus. Similar like a slat technique. So this technique gives you very encouraging results. Those videos we have seen, these are the post-operative pictures of same patients. And some few more post-operative pictures showing the results of the slit as well as the conjunctival limbal autograft. So if you do it clearly, nicely, dissection, covering the bare sclera, you can get the satisfactory results. In pterygium surgery, the main concern is of recurrence. And whenever there is recurrence, it is always very aggressive with violent inflammatory and fibroblastic proliferation. So in such recurrence, we require to reduce the inflammation. We can reduce surgically induced inflammation, which is in our hand by minimal surgical manipulation. We can use the autologous serum to paste the grafts to reduce the inflammation, as it reduces more inflammation than the fibrin glue and the sutures. So in recurrent pterygium, I always prefer amniotic membrane along with the conjunctival limbal autograft. So here you can see the pterygium excision is done as you have already seen, but sometimes in recurrent pterygium we have to very careful in dissection that in beneath this recurrent pterygium you may get the thinner area scarring, or even the scleral thinning may be present. So one needs to be very careful while dissection. So after doing the excision, you can put the amniotic membrane, and over the amniotic membrane, conjunctival limbal autograft can be placed. So there are certain factors that predispose to the recurrence, and they can be surgically related. These surgically related factors, they include irregular keratectomy, incomplete removal of the fibrotic tissue as seen here, which attracts the inflammation and in turn it causes the recurrence. So the dissection, keratectomy and the pterygium excisions should give the topographically smooth surface. There may be incomplete removal of the tenons or the pterygium tissue. So extended removal always helps to reduce the recurrences. Conjunctival graft with tenons can lead to the contraction of the graft. So thin graft without tenons is always appreciated. If we are putting the sutures, there should not be any tension over the conjunctival sutures or the edges of the conjunctiva.
Excuse me, we have to go fast now.
Yes. Conjunctival edges, there should not be any bare sclera or dehiscence. It should be covered. Conjunctiva can be covered very nicely, the bare sclera. So to reduce the recurrence, we have to achieve normal topographically smooth surface. We have to do the extended removal of fibrovascular tissue. We need to go for the good coverage of the bare sclera and replace the stem cell. So by these techniques, we adopt these techniques, we can stop the recurrence and we can manage the different types of pterygium. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya Madam, for a wonderful lecture. Now it's time for Tia Munawar Madam, who is a prolific corneal surgeon, medical consultant at Cornea and Refractive Services, Arvind Eye Hospital, Chennai. She has many publications to her name. She will be speaking on OCT-based corneal topography. Does it aid? Over to you, Madam. And request you to be finishing within time because next lot is already waiting.
Thank you for the opportunity, BOA, and a special mention to Nikhil Gokhale, sir, for giving me this opportunity. A very good afternoon to all the panelists here. So my topic would be OCT-based corneal topography. Does it really aid in the diagnosis? I have no financial interest to disclose. So as we all know, the corneal topography is a non-contact imaging technique that maps the shape and features of the corneal surface. So we generally compare it with the tip of an iceberg. So the topography devices are able to give us an idea about a large part of the anterior segment. However, complete pachymetric evaluation is not possible with the topography. So for this, we use the corneal tomography, which evaluates the whole cornea by obtaining information from both the anterior and posterior corneal surfaces. And they're also able to reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the anterior segment. So we need to have a good understanding of the corneal imaging techniques for good clinical applications and decision making as well. So some of the types of topography and tomographers that we have is the Placido disc, which is nothing but one of the first methods to measure the anterior corneal surface was the Placido disc. And it consists of circular targets of alternating concentric circles, which are called the Myers. So examination of the reflected rings gives us an information about the shape of the cornea. The initial use of a Placido disc was more to be of qualitative use, and with newer developments and with lot of sophisticated softwares, now these reflection patterns are used to create quantitative data and also color-coded maps as seen in the video keratographs. So Placido disc-based devices are also being combined with other technologies now to give us a comprehensive view of the cornea. The limitation of, the Placido disc is again, it does not give the posterior surface maps. So the next technology is the scanning slit, and this was the first attempt to study the posterior surface of the cornea. The prototype for this would be the OpScan. So the scanning slit basically is a projective technique that measures the triangulation between the reference slit. So the reference slit and also the reflected beam, which is being captured by a camera. And the OpScan is a combination of the three-dimensional scanning slit beam system, and also an added Placido system which is attached to it. So there basically 40 slits are being projected sequentially on the cornea, 20 nasally and 20 temporally, and these get overlapped in a pattern that you can see in the diagram below. And this data is interpreted using triangulation. And the final image is represented as a three-dimensional topographic map, including the curvature, elevation, and pachymetric maps of the entire corneal surface. The next technology that's available is the Scheimpflug technique. So this is basically the technique where a planar subject is not parallel to the image plane. What they do is they use an oblique tangent, and this can be drawn from the image object and the lens planes. And the point of intersection that is formed is the Scheimpflug intersection. So the pentacam provides data in the form of anterior, posterior, sagittal, and tangential curvature, and also gives us the refractive power maps and anterior and posterior elevation maps. So it basically has two cameras. One is the rotating Scheimpflug camera, which captures about 50 cross-sectional images on an angle from 0 to 180 degrees. And captures 25,000 data points in approximately 2 seconds. So in case in that 2 seconds, the patient tends to blink or move his eye, the second camera, which is the static camera, monitors this eye fixation and also detects the pupil size. Now coming to the anterior segment optical coherence tomography technique. So this is basically, this was introduced for imaging the retina. And advancements in longer wavelength light source has enabled high resolution cross-sectional anterior segment imaging. So optical coherence tomography, as we all know, is again a non-contact, non-invasive imaging technique and is used to obtain very high resolution images. So the principle, it works on the principle of low coherence interferometry. So basically, the interferometry is the technique of superimposing two or more waves to detect the differences between them. So it works because either the two waves within the same frequency with the same phase will add on to each other, or they will subtract.
You have to speed up, please.
Okay, yes, I'll do that. So the various types, as we know, are the time domain, spectral domain, and the swept source OCT. And I would be talking about the MS39 anterior segment OCT, which is based on the Placido disc and the spectral domain OCT concept. So the MS39 is capable of topographic maps and its summaries. It gives us the anterior segment OCT sections. It also gives us pupillography, NIBUT, and lens biometry, and also glaucoma screening modules. So the corneal topography will tell us about the epithelial thickness, the stromal thickness, stromal elevation, the epithelium Zernike, flap mapping in cases which have already been treated, who have undergone LASIK, and the Bellin ABCD keratoconus staging, and the Gaussian anterior and posterior maps. So epithelial mapping, again, epithelial map uses the OCT module and is used for measuring the 9 millimeters of epithelial surface. So the corneal epithelium is able to remodel and mask topographic and keratometric abnormalities of the underlying Bowman's layer, and also the stromal irregularities in conditions like keratoconus. So this imaging and analysis helps the of the corneal epithelium and stroma independently, gives us a deep understanding of the underlying conditions. So this is something which the machine is able to segregate and tell us. So again, coming to the keratoconus screening, apart from the anterior and the posterior tangential sagittal maps, it also gives us an idea of the epithelial thickness and the stromal thickness separately. So again, the stromal elevation map is a good tool for decision making for a refractive procedure, as in ectatic disorders, because the true pathology in an ectatic disorder lies in the stroma. And this can help in early detection or subclinical cases can be found out easily. Again, so the keratoconus screening markers, there are a couple of points that would be projected on this right screen, the lowermost screen. So when the points are too close to each other, then there is a possibility of keratoconus. So this is also projected on the screen. So the interesting thing is about this Gaussian map, which the machine projects. The Gaussian curvature is nothing but the product of the steepest and the flattest local curves at each point. Whereas the sagittal and tangential map will show us curvatures along the surface meridians, whereas the Gaussian map will show us at a particular point. So this is able to precisely locate the corneal apex objectively, and it also negates astigmatism and projects ectasia to us. So you can, this is a real curvature map. Again, this machine is also able to tell us the normative database. That is the pattern deviation map also shows the value of the difference from the average of the healthy population and what the patient is actually presenting. So there is it shows us how much standard deviation is available. Okay, next, coming to the enantiomorphism summary. Enantiomorphism is nothing but the mirror symmetry between the right and the left corneas. So you get a bilateral summary of both the right and the left eye. So this basically helps in differentiating between the normal and the keratoconic corneas by analyzing the inter-eye corneal asymmetry, like, you know, looking at certain parameters, like looking at the steep and the flat keratometry values, anterior elevation of the thinnest point, and parameters like that. The other nice thing about the anterior segment OCT is the presence of this optical quality panel display. So this basically gives us a simulation of the visual acuity of the cornea. So this is good to explain to the patient. So you can explain to the patient as to how his vision actually is right now. And when the right corner shows the Zernike analysis map, and it has an advanced system where you can actually negate all the higher order aberrations. And when you project it to the patient, they know that when the higher order aberrations are removed, the vision quality improves, and it can also give us an idea of the night vision of the patient. So this is useful for patients whom we are planning TCAT and such procedures. You can also compare the differential maps of the right and the left eye and the same eye in sequential order. So when you have a patient of keratoconus who are following up for, you know, over a period of time, if you want to know that if the patient is progressing, then these maps really help us, and you can always differentiate the epithelium and the stroma. So it gives us a clue. Apart from this, it also gives us idea of,
please.
Yeah, I'm almost done, sir. Yeah. So it also helps us, apart from the corneal topography, it can also help us analyze the tear film. It also gives us measurements of the pupillography and the lens biometry by the ray tracing technology. So to conclude, it is one technology that is able to, you know, give us multiple aspects such as epithelium stromal mapping, and also helps in looking at progression of the disease and in planning and decision making for refractive surgeries as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you all the faculty members. Thank you the people who are conducting the session along with me, and thank you and apologies for the delay to the organizers. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
sir.
Thank you, Ragini and Lane sir, once again, a wonderful show and such a nice speaker for this session.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the wonderful show is because of you all, the stars of this galaxy. Dr. Karandikar, sir, no problems with the time, because you all took the time to come and to spend time with us. So a few minutes here and there do not matter. There is a huge audience. There are 4,000 plus people watching, and everybody is enjoying the science that you all are teaching. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, Nikhil Gokhale, especially for putting up this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful lineup.
Thank you.
Thank you, Basak sir. Thank you, Karandikar sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sushmita, Kavita, Dr. Sirish. Thank you so much, and all the lovely speakers.